Mic check 1 2 1 2. It's the Y2K collector, and publishers are genuinely afraid. Video game publishers have a true fear that for a while I wasn't sure how valid this fear was. But as time goes on, and as I read comments from the gaming community, I watch different videos on YouTube. I look at the sales of more modern and recent games. I'm starting to understand the real reason that publishers have such an issue with allowing older titles to be accessible through the Video Game History Foundation or the Historical Video Game Foundation. I can't remember which one it is, but many of you remember that legal battle that took place not that long ago over copyright, right? Basically, the Historical Gaming Foundation wanted to be able to create a repository of older retro video games that individuals could access for research purposes. Basically, they wanted to have like an archived, space, kind of like a library for anyone to be able to access video games so that they could go back and see what these games were like, what they were about. And ultimately, these gaming publishers put up a massive fight, and that access was denied. It was blocked. And so, individuals will not be able to access, some of these retro video games or some of these retro titles. They won't be able to access them because of copyright laws. And the real reason that these publishers are afraid of allowing such access is they're ultimately afraid that older video games will cannibalize the video game industry. They're ultimately afraid that people who start to play these games for research will ultimately like them, and not only like them, but like them more than some of the newer games that are coming out. And unfortunately, these older games don't make video game companies as much money as the newer games. That's part one. And part two, these newer games cost a lot more money to create, develop, and publish than some of these older titles. Gaming studios today are investing millions of dollars in games that barely impact the Richter scale. They barely do numbers, and they're spending all this money on these games to create these games, but no one really cares. Gamers are not interested in them. And surprisingly enough, some of these older games that have a fraction of the budget are the games that a lot of gamers are going back to. And not just older gamers or folks that are older in the gaming community. You have youngsters, you have the Gen Z and Gen Alpha. The younger generation, once they're exposed to these games, because a lot of them haven't been exposed to it yet. A lot of the younger generation, they're still on Fortnite, they're still on Call of Duty, they're still playing a lot of these modern games, and a lot of them have never even had an opportunity to play some of these retro games because they just don't have access to the physical games themselves, right? And, the average young person isn't going to go and, try and emulate a bunch of games. They're going to just play whatever games their parents buy for them. But what you're seeing is that once this younger generation does get a taste of retro games, once they do get a taste of some of these Super Nintendo and Genesis games, some of these N64 games, some of these GameCube games, a lot of them are getting hooked on the simplicity of these games and the fun factor. They don't have to worry about updates, they don't have to worry about patches. And even though some of these games do have little quirks and glitches to them, the mere fact that these games are purely designed and made to have fun, that's it. There's a huge draw on these games, right? These retro games are really pulling the younger generation in. And it's crazy to think that publishers are so afraid of these games winning over a younger generation or even generations to come, that they're like, you know what? No, we do not want anyone having access to these games in the future. We don't want 15, 20 years from now when we're trying to sell our PlayStation 6s and our PlayStation 9s and, our newest consoles. We don't want the sales of those newer systems and newer games to be derailed because of a generation that's going backwards in time and looking for older games. And I think that, just realizing this, it's very powerful because I mean, there's a lot of implications when you consider that. One, it makes you think, well, what will the value of physical games really be in the future? Especially if companies, you know, well, they've already banned, any kind of, you know, uh, repository or free space where people can access these games. Technology is only going to get better and smarter, right? Who knows what lengths publishers will go through to be able to cut down on emulation. I don't think you'll ever be able to completely stop emulation, but I'm sure that there are lengths that companies will go through to minimize emulation. Believe me, if emulation begins to make a significant dent in the bottom line of video game companies and video game publishers, you better believe that those companies are going to take the necessary steps to shut down emulation. I'll give you an example. Nike had one of its worst years last year in terms of profits. It was so bad that the CEO got fired and they had to bring back someone who used to be on the executive team to actually run the company. And one of the things that Nike has been doing is they have been slapping everyone with a lawsuit. If you sell Nike products without Nike's approval, they're coming after you. And they've been coming after companies like StockX, um, different aftermarket resellers, and they've been hitting them with lawsuits for selling either fake Nikes or unauthorized Nike sneakers. And this is putting these second and third party companies in a position where they may have to stop selling Nike products altogether. And a big part of this is because Nike's bottom line was being impacted. It was being impacted by some of these second parties and also some of these, second and third party vendors weren't properly vetting the products that they were selling to customers. They were selling fake Nike sneakers and things like that. So when all these things began to affect Nike's bottom line, they took legal action. And that's the last thing you want is a major company coming down your neck with lawyers. And so I say that to say that if these major gaming companies, right, if Sony, Nintendo, um, Capcom, Konami, you know, any of these major publishers, any of these major video game companies, if their bottom line starts to take a big enough hit and they recognize that that hit that they're taking is being caused by emulation, I can guarantee you right now that the first thing they will do is start slapping these emulation companies or anyone who has anything to do with pirated software, anyone who has anything to do with illegitimate games being sold, whether it's being sold in a hardware fashion on these emulation devices, whether it's sites that are being ran that provide users with ROMs or emulators. They will come in with a legal team and shut all that down. And this is why I don't think emulation is as safe as some people think it is. Because, like I said, if you start hitting a company's bottom line hard enough, they will come and shut you down. And I think, I don't, like I said, I don't think you'll ever completely get rid of emulation, but I could easily see a day where companies make it very difficult for the average consumer to emulate video games. And if they're willing to put up a strong enough fight to shut down copyright access for historical and research purposes, you better believe they're going to shut down anything that people are using just for consumer enjoyment. So I think it's really interesting. Does this mean that you should go out and buy up a bunch of physical video games? No. I do think though that if there is a particular video game or if there are certain games that you really enjoy, I think it would be good to at least get those games physically. You don't need to get every video game physically, but I think it would be good to get the games that you really like physically, just in case. Um, and you don't have to break the bank, you don't have to spend a ton of money, but if you can, I would do so just because, that tells me a lot. And times are getting tough. Companies are starting to get real lean, and they're going to start taking swift, decisive action to protect their intellectual property. And it'd just be an interesting thing to see. I could be absolutely wrong, but I'm interested to know your thoughts. Let me know down in the comments what you think about this, and I'll catch you in the next video. It's the Y2K Collector. Take it easy.